Our next speaker is Dr. Derek Burdette, and he is an assistant professor, but not for long, of art history in the School of Art and Art History at the University of Florida, where he specializes in the arts of colonial Latin America, with a particular focus on the intersections of art, religion, and colonization in New Spain. His first book, Miraculous Celebrity, The Señor de Ixmiquilpan and Colonial Piety in Mexico City, 1545 to 1845, is now out, right? Out soon, in press, any day, with the University of Texas Press in Austin. So join me in welcoming Dr. Burdette.
First off, I'd like to make sure you can hear me. Great. I'd like to thank Cristina Gonzalez and Mark White for the gracious invitation to participate in this weekend's events, as well as the New Mexico Museum of Art and the Carl and Marilyn Toma Foundation that helped make the symposium possible. It is quite a rare opportunity for us to all be in the same place speaking to one another. It's really great. I would also like to offer Cristina and Mark congratulations on the exhibition, which reflects a great deal of vision and hard work. The exhibition does a particularly wonderful job of not just bringing into focus a wide array of saints and saintly figures that people across New Spain looked to for inspiration and who they prayed to in times of need, but it also succeeds in helping us understand what the visual culture looked like that made those saints and saintly figures knowable to those people. This fantastic artwork here, for example, painted by Juan Rodriguez Juarez around 1720, captures an array of saints and popular devotions, including the Holy Family and the Apostles, as well as more local figures that we've mentioned in the last couple days. While the other talks at the symposium will surely shed light onto the significance of many of those saints and sacred figures, in my talk today I'll focus on a slightly different, although I think no less important, aspect of religious culture from New Spain, the veneration of miraculous imagery. In fact, we need look no further than Rodriguez Juarez's composition to find proof of the centrality of miraculous icons to New Spanish devotion. Here at the center of the composition, we find a portrait of the Virgen de Guadalupe, which by the 18th century had emerged as the region's most celebrated miraculous icon, and which, I would wager, many of you might already be able to recognize. The tilma image on the left, which devotees understand to have been created without human intervention in the 16th century when the Virgin filled the cloak of a man named Juan Diego with flowers, is undoubtedly the best-known miraculous image from the region. But it was not alone. I would like you to think about miraculous images as any artwork that people believed capable of transcending the laws of nature and impacting the world around them. So sometimes they grew or shrank or sweat or bled or cured people's illnesses or addressed big, large problems, changed forms, became beautiful, these types of things. Such images saturated the religious landscape of New Spain during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. In my talk today, I want to look beyond the Virgin of Guadalupe and introduce you to a few of the other influential miraculous images from the period, to explain a bit more about how people understood them, how people appealed to them in times of need, and how people used other artworks, like painted and printed portraits of the miraculous images, to forge personal connections to those icons. I was really excited to see Gregorio Lopez appear so substantially in the exhibition because he offers the perfect foil for miraculous artworks in New Spain, which were venerated alongside holy figures within churches, chapels, and home altars. In fact, Lopez's biography, or perhaps it would be more appropriate to say the biography of his corporeal remains, crossed paths with one of New Spain's most powerful miraculous artworks in a way that highlights both their similarities and differences. And here we see Gregorio Lopez kneeling in the corner of this piece, but you'll also see him in, I think, 4 or 5 other paintings in the exhibition. These are all artworks that are not that well known and have not been exhibited as publicly as they should have been. After arriving in New Spain in 1562, Lopez lived as a hermit in the desert, following the footsteps of other Spanish mystics and saints. During his life, those around him were captivated by him and viewed him as saintly, and after his death, Lopez's remains were treasured. His bones were understood as relics which could radiate presentia, the physical presence of the holy that both inspired and created wonder. In 1616, his close friend and official biographer, Francisco de Losa, became the first chaplain of a newly founded convent, the Convento de San Josef, which was located only 2 blocks away from the center of Mexico City. Here, in another amazing painting from the exhibition, Losa is seen on the left with his hand on the hagiographic book that he'd written to extol the sanctity of Lopez. His condition for accepting the role of chaplain at the convent was that he be allowed to bring the remains of Lopez with him. The convent, by the way, is just 2 blocks east of the cathedral, and the cathedral you can see is just 2 blocks below this map. Once again, in a callback to James, east is up on this map. Today, that convent, when you approach, this is the facade. It was executed in the 1680s, and that convent is actually now one of Mexico City's most cutting-edge contemporary art spaces. It's known as the Ex Teresa Art Actual. Anybody who's in Mexico City, it's fantastic. You get to see an old church and new art. It's great. At the convent, Lopez's bones were held in a small velvet-covered chest in a semi-private chapel, technically within the convent itself, but visible to the broader public through a barred window that connected it to the convent's church. For those who either entered and peered into the chapel, for those who either entered or peered into the chapel, the chance to approach the remains of the holy figure would have been powerful. They would have felt awe and wonder, and would likely have been moved to prayer, perhaps directing their thoughts and implorations towards Lopez himself, seeking his aid or support. What is most remarkable to me, and what brings us to the main focus of my talk, is that just above the ornate chest containing the remains of Gregorio Lopez hung yet another sacred figure that would capture the religious imagination of Mexico City for centuries to come, a life-sized statue of Christ on the cross, known as the Señor de Xmiquilpan. That statue had been made during the middle of the 16th century before eventually falling into a state of disrepair at a small mining town north of Mexico City, a few miles outside of the city of Ixmiquilpan, which is how it got that name. According to period accounts, which are here illustrated in a pair of 18th century paintings, the deteriorated statue underwent a miraculous renovation in the year of 1621. It restored itself to a state of beauty without any human intervention, and then it perspired both blood and crystalline substances. Those who flocked to see the Cristo Renovado, as the renovated Christ was sometimes known, described it as having an otherworldly beauty, and even a few reported seeing the statue change its appearance or cure the infirmed. After its renovation, the statue was carried off to Mexico City, and ultimately it was given to the Carmelites, who installed it within their semi-private chapel, just above the corporeal relics of Gregorio Lopez. For a few short years, these 2 objects resided side by side, in a remarkable concentration of what the religious historian Carolyn Walker Bynum has called holy matter. What I find so fascinating about this moment in the 1620s, when the 2 objects resided so closely together, is that no one who peered through the bars to observe the altar could have anticipated the surprising trajectory that awaited the relics or the miraculous image. Gregorio Lopez's path to official sainthood must have seemed inevitable to Losa and to the others who had known him. But it was ultimately derailed by the colonial politics of the early modern church, which is a topic that I'm sure many of our other speakers could address more eloquently than I could. Meanwhile, the prodigious statue that had just been confiscated from a very small mining outpost ultimately evolved into one of the most powerful and highly venerated icons in all of New Spain. Its renovation was subjected to a formal investigation in 1679, and the archbishop confirmed its miraculous nature. Almost 200 years later, in 1798, the structure that once housed both objects was demolished to make way for a grand masterpiece of neoclassical architecture, whose whole purpose was to manifest the religious authority of the Señor de Xmiquilpan. I have to mention the photograph on the right was taken by Guillermo Calo, whose skill as a photographer was eventually overshadowed by the prodigious production of his daughter. The comparison of the two figures, López and the Señor de Xmiquilpan, to me is telling. Whereas saints were made in Rome and thus subject to all kinds of biases about the Americas, miraculous icons could be investigated and confirmed in Mexico City by the archbishop and his retinue. Starting in the middle of the 1600s, they were confirmed in bunches. So while New Spain had no local saints to speak of until long after independence, it did become home to many, many miraculous icons. Starting in the early 17th century, the floodgates opened and artworks like the Señor de Xmiquilpan cropped up across the region, acquiring sizable followings amongst the faithful and ushering in what the historian William Taylor has called the golden age of miraculous imagery in New Spain. One of the primary roles that miraculous imagery played in New Spanish society was that of divine advocate during times of citywide crises. For people across the early modern Catholic world, including residents of New Spain, epidemics and other environmental catastrophes were understood as the result of divine ire, and thus it reasoned that the afflicted population should seek ways to appease God's anger and secure his mercy. Europeans had long turned to specialized saints in such circumstances, including Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, and, as I learned last night, Santa Rosalia. And others turned to the Virgin Mary, who was implored to protect the population in return for their devotion. It should come as no surprise that the Virgin of Guadalupe's intervention on behalf of the residents of Mexico City and New Spain in general has been the most celebrated and discussed from the period. Here I'm showing you a print commemorating the Virgin of Guadalupe's intervention in 1737 when the city was struck by matlazáhuatl, or typhus. This artwork was designed by the well-known painter José de Ibarra and engraved and printed in 1743 by the printmaker Baltasar Troncoso. The print lays bare the logic underpinning the Virgin's intervention. In the center of the print, we can see the problem. We see piles of corpses and suffering victims stacked one atop the other. And in the background, you can see the city's urban landscape. For those who lived through the epidemic, this would have been a clear invocation of the thousands of dead who were carried outside of the city's boundaries to avoid contagion. On either side of the foreground, aldermen of Mexico City, who patronized the creation of the artwork and the book it belonged to, are shown in various poses of prayer, hands held out and clasped together. The gaze of the figure on the left, who seems to glow under the radiant light of the Virgin above, directs our own gaze up toward the tilma, who is carried down toward the city by a team of cherubs. The image is emblazoned upon a shield, quite literally communicating her role as defender of the city's residents. In truth, the act of imploring a miraculous image to defend the city's residents was never carried out by a few elegantly dressed officials in a remote location. Instead, as this spectacular painting from a little more than a decade earlier makes clear, such appeals would have been carried out through large-scale ritual processions that gathered people of all walks of life to deliver their appeals in unison. Here, people in Mexico City have gathered to appeal to the Virgin of Loreto, a local miraculous image that was housed at the Jesuit church of San Pedro y San Pablo, which itself was a copy of yet another miraculous statue that was housed in Italy. Rituals like this one were, unfortunately, all too common in New Spain, and they were one of the main ways that miraculous images fit into New Spanish culture. The statues and paintings were more than just representations of divine figures or even powerful interlocutors to whom people could turn to for individual prayers. They were divine advocates to whom whole communities turned in order to try to survive plagues, pestilence, and uncertainty. Another key way in which miraculous images like the Virgin of Loreto fit into the lives of New Spanish devotees was through a genre of portraits that aimed to reproduce the effect of gazing upon the image within the altar context. These verdaderos retratos, or true portraits as they're known, were not unique to New Spain, and in fact, they're common across the Spanish Empire. In some ways, we can think of them as integral aspects of the visual culture that connected people to the divine. Here on the right, in this anonymous true portrait of the Virgin of Loreto from the Museo Nacional del Virreinato in Mexico, you see the basic features that define the genre. A statue resting in an altar context, flanked by curtains and ornamental objects, whether they be lamps, candles, floral arrangements, ex votos, or devotional artworks. I'd like to take what time I have left today to show you just a few more examples of this genre, showcasing the breadth of styles and approaches found within these paintings, and also giving you a sense of how these and other similar objects gave devotees a personal, material avenue for connecting with the miraculous images that they were so devoted to. Here is a wonderful example of the genre, a large-scale painting by José de Mora, that captures the appearance of a miraculous crucifix known as the Señor de Chalma, which was one of the most important miraculous images at the end of the viceregal period and which continues to be a major point of popular devotion in Mexico today. The Señor de Chalma is understood by devotees to have miraculously appeared within a cave 60 miles south of Mexico City near the city of Malinalco, which is another fantastic monastery site. And that cave was a site which had previously played an important role in indigenous religious practices in the area. Its apparition, the Señor de Chalma's apparition, supplanted older ritual practices with newer ones. And here in this print, you can see that the Señor de Chalma is surrounded by a radiant burst of light, and his apparition is displacing a demonic figure that you can see in the upper right, who has a tail and horns and a howling open mouth, and he's accompanied by a pair of serpents. And here we can see this displacement, the logic of this displacement being played out. By the 18th century, the shrine dedicated to the statue had emerged as a major focal point of Augustinian devotion in the area and a major pilgrimage site for many across the viceroyalty. Returning to Mora's true portrait, we can see that he has faithfully reproduced the statue's form, including its abruptly fallen head, which acts as a type of visual shorthand for the statue's identity. The life-size crucifix is shown hanging from a cross within the ornate altar context, and its loincloth, which in the period was called the sandal, is typical of the period. You can see this grand flourish. These were one of the things that were given to statues by devotees, and so these sandales were changed on a regular basis, and you can date the paintings based upon their faithful representation at times of what the statue would have been wearing at the time. Notice that Mora has depicted the scene from below, so that the viewer looks up at the statue, recreating the experience of looking at the image enshrined within an altar. Below the statue, almost at eye level for the viewer, is an array of floral arrangements created from metal and enamel that are set into blue and white ceramic vessels that were either imported from the Far East or were meant to look as though they were. This and other artworks like it are examples of how some of the best artists in New Spain applied their talents to create incredibly lifelike depictions of statues and paintings that made the viewer feel as though they were looking at the object itself. Not all true portraits, however, were executed by the region's finest masters, and here I'm showing you two examples of paintings, both housed at the Museo del Virreinato, that I argue are also true portraits of the Señor de Chalma. Both follow the formula of all true portraiture, depicting a statue at the center and a decorated altar context around it. Unlike other, many more celebrated examples, these paintings are far more stylized, however. Instead of realism, here we get abstraction. Flower arrangements have been distilled down to their barest geometric shapes. And yet, notice that in each painting, the anonymous artist has taken pains to show the statue with its characteristic downcast head, which sets the Señor de Chalma apart from other crucifixes. In these paintings, we can see a trace of the popularity of the statue's cult and the importance of artworks that less wealthy people could buy to forge personal, individualized connections with the statue. They could place the paintings in their own local church or shrine, or even within their own homes. Kneeling beneath such an image, a devotee would have been able to collapse the distance between themselves and the miraculous image that might be quite far away in a shrine located miles or days of travel afar away. If we think of the statues as akin to saints, then these portraits are akin to the proliferation of unauthorized relics. For most people, including many indigenous and black residents of New Spain who might have had less resources to spend on artworks, it would have been through printed true portraits that they could have forged lasting connections to the region's miraculous icons. A print like this one, which was actually embedded within a devotional history of the Señor de Chalma, has distilled the component parts down to the basics. The statue's bright body contrasts with the darkened background, and symmetrical displays of candlesticks and stylized floral arrangements evoke the standard altar context. Although not a masterpiece by art historical standards, artworks like this one were vital to the devotional lives of most people. By that standard, these humble prints can be considered important and significant images worthy of our attention. The art historian Kelly Donahue Wallace, who's a specialist in vice-regal print culture, has noted that prints were relatively affordable, and thus that people from all walks of life collected prints, embedding them in prayer books, keeping them in their pockets, or hanging them from their walls at home. The search of Inquisition documents at the National Archive in Mexico City reveals lots of cases in Inquisition files of people who got up to no good with prints. It would seem that prints is what you were using if you were doing slightly scandalous things with your devotional images. They were offered for sale at the shrines where miraculous icons were venerated and could be produced by devotees during their visits. Such prints would not only have been representations of the miraculous images, but also physical reminders of the moments that people shared in their presence. Some of the hundreds, if not thousands of printed true portraits from the period were simple woodblock prints. Others were complex engravings of the finest quality. Here I'm showing you a random array. Many of these are drawn from the John Carter Brown Library's collection, which is available online. And if you're looking for some place to look at old printed materials, I suggest it as a place to start. Regardless of their precise appearance, prints such as these offered a material connection to the region's miraculous imagery and objects to which people could turn during their prayers. By way of conclusion, I just wanted to offer a brief nod to the continued role that miraculous images play in Catholic devotional landscapes, both in Mexico and right here in New Mexico today. As you all likely know far better than I do, one can travel only a short distance to the Santuario de Chimayo, for example, and encounter the miraculous image of Christ crucified known as the Señor de Esquipulas, which has been venerated at that site for more than 200 years, and which can, in turn, be traced back to an even older cult dedicated to a miraculous image of the same name from Guatemala. The Santuario is among the most active pilgrimage sites in the United States, and a monument to the continued importance of a tradition that can be traced back to New Spain. I hope that my talk today has helped us think a little bit more about miraculous images and how they might have been seen as saintly figures in their own right. I also hope it's helped to highlight some of the roles that miraculous images played in New Spanish society, and the many artworks that were created to help forge connections between devotees and the icons that were so central to New Spanish life. Lastly, I hope that it might make you see a few of the paintings in the wonderful exhibition in a new light. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you, Derek. That was a beautiful presentation. I have a question it's specifically regards the term, and you can see it up there in a few of these images, verdadero retrato, right?
Yeah.
True portrait, true
Yes.
image. And because I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the significance of that term with religious images, like these ones of statues and of a painting, the Virgin of Guadalupe is up there. That's so 3 and 2-dimensional miraculous objects. And is there a way to contextualize that with how that term is used in portraits of people, of living individuals? Because it appears in portraiture too. I believe it appears in some of the Gregorio Lopez images, but also in like non-holy people, like regular.
Yeah, a vera effigie, or there's the.
Yeah, and so, what I'm wondering is because so many of these these images look stationary, right? Sort of stiff, still.
Mm-hmm.
They're captured the way that they appear in the altar.
Yep.
But you showed another image of, I think it was the Virgin of Loreto in a procession.
Yeah.
And she's twisting, she's turned, there she is. She's looking at us like she's alive.
Yeah.
So there's this, excuse me, really interesting kind of, a tension or a contrast. And then the one on the left, she's stiff, she's...
Right back to being frozen, yeah.
Yeah, and so I tend to think of the term verdadero retrato as something that's not just imitative of how somebody or something looked, but it captures something of the essence, in portraiture, the morality, the moral quality, for example, of an individual. And so if you could just, these are sort of loose thoughts, but if you can see how I'm thinking, if you could relate sort of secular to religious imagery that uses that term, and then sort of that stiffness to the life-likeness.
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. I want to first just take a second to say that this painting in particular has been worked on by Luisa Elena Alcalá and Patricia Calleros, and just to say, they've done great work on this painting, and everything I know about it came from them. So often we lose those, we lose those trails. I think you're onto something about the work that word is doing, and I like that you have suggested that perhaps we should understand it not as a realistic portrait, but a portrait that accesses some truth that might be larger than just what you are able to visually encounter if you were to see the person or the thing, right? So that it is essentializing, that the portrait is able to essentialize the thing that is most true about this figure and represent it, right? And I think that's what is the overlap in the Venn diagram between portraits that mean to capture the likeness of people and portraits that capture the likeness of a miraculous image. I would love to hear from others, perhaps over coffee, about that intersection, because I think I have more to learn than to share about that word in particular. But I would add one more detail that I think brings into focus how we can understand what people might have assumed about a painting if it was called a true portrait. And that has to do with the ways in which these paintings were further authorized. So many, but not all, of the fanciest large-scale, life-sized, giant portraits that were produced, the patrons would have worked really hard to have those paintings touched to the original so that they would have moved from just a representation of that sacred image to a contact relic of that sacred image. And I think that the fact that people actually wanted to have their paintings and that they succeeded in having some number of these paintings imbued with the sacred essence of the original gets at what the brand of true portraiture was in New Spain, which was that these objects, unlike other images, these objects could be set apart by their veracity, that they were true representations, but that truth meant that they would be more effective vehicles for communing with the represented figure. right? So that the truth that I think people were after was like a faster broadband connection to the Señor de Chalma and the miraculous authority that was contained within it, right? So that they were hopeful that their portraits could be effectively contact relics that could bring with the image a little bit of its authority. The way that people fill little vessels, sometimes fancy vessels, sometimes Tupperware, with the earth from Chimayo, right? Like to take something with them that is of the essence. That was a long answer. I apologize. I know we're tight on time.
Well said, though, elegantly said, and I completely agree with you. I think we're kind of children of Plato, and we rest on mimesis when we see that, true portrait phrase, but it's more about truthfulness in a context, in a divine context, in a sacred context, and as a vehicle for, the prototype. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that presentation. It's illuminating to me. And I have just a question, or get your opinion on the altarpiece at Chimayo, if you could put up the photo. I've looked at this for a long time and wondered what the influence was on the design elements and color. And there was a connection with Guatemala. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if those motifs and colors may have come from there, or maybe there's a theme like this of indigenous art in New Mexico. I'm just curious if you have any insights on that.
This is a great question. This is a question that comes up right to the edge of the border of the things that I know about, and then crosses right over it into things that I don't know about, right? And so what I can say for certain is that the cult in Guatemala is dedicated to a statue of Christ on the cross that is black in color, that is very different in appearance, and the connection between the cult in Guatemala and the cult here in New Mexico has to do with a lot of the themes that we've heard about already, which is that the people there were devotees here who were influenced by Franciscans who had been there. And there was a kind of chain of communication that led from one place to the next, and thus there was a source of inspiration. The artistic character of the shrine here is something that I hope that maybe someone else in the room might be able to help us speak more eloquently about, but I think I would be doing more harm than good in trying to field that question, so I apologize.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to that observation that this question of verdadero retratos are also applicable to secular portraits. As someone who's written about portraiture, I think we're all aware when you look at colonial portraits, it's not entirely about duplicating what someone looks like. There's an element of that, especially around the face, but these are like carefully confected images that are meant to kind of stress qualities related to questions of character or status. You want to represent humility, faith, like you see the brides of Christ, the nun portraits, or if you want to stress subjects, chastity, innocence, you see that in portraits of young women, usually holding flowers that are budding. These kinds of images were used to contract matrimony, to present children to society, or if you want to represent status and power or wealth. So the portraits themselves, are really, when you see the word verdadero retrato, which is applicable to these, it's not about just capturing the likeness, it's about kind of parsing, teasing out some quality about the individual that goes beyond appearance. So it's really applicable across the board, in terms of the idea of the verdadero retrato. Sor Juana writes about this in her writings, about the verdadero retrato, And the last comment I wanted to make, I'm really interested in sort of these representations, where they're painted or printed, of sculptures of saints, because this provides an avenue to connect it to New Mexico. When you look at many of the painted retablos, what you're really looking at is, I tell my students, these aren't images of saints. They are paintings of sculptures of saints. And you see them here in the retablos. Many of them have the drape element that has been drawn. That they're situated on shelves, surrounded by other ornamental or ceremonial objects. So in New Mexico, that tradition really is one of the dominant kinds of forms of representation of these holy figures. So there's like a major connection there with this kind of material and what you see up here.
Okay, last question. Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. I wanted to ask, when Christina asked a question last night about, where's the sanctity? And is the sanctity all gone into the image rather than into real life saints? And further than that, is that any different from what happens in the old world, or is that also what you see there? Two questions.
Can you repeat? So, compared to the old world, yes. Where's the sanctity?
Yeah. Is the sanctity not in people, not in saints, but is it in objects?
Yeah, right. I'll come back to the mic. To rephrase the question so make sure everybody heard, Christina asked a question last night about where do we find the sanctity? Are we seeing sanctity moving from saints to images, and how does that compare to Europe? I think that folks have developed a pretty general consensus that the cult of miraculous imagery that emerges in the 1620s really firmly and then just sort of skyrockets through the 1820s is more intense and more prolonged than what we might be seeing in Europe. In contrast, the 16th century in Europe, you see a cult of miraculous imagery that is not echoed in the Americas. And so they're definitely on different tracks. And we see, I would love to talk to people who know more about the relics, because I have often felt as though the Americas was by comparison, devoid of corporeal relics compared to Europe, and that imagery did fulfill that role, right? And I hesitate to say that the absence of evidence about the lived experiences of people suggests that there weren't lived experiences of those people, but we can say for certain that one place that you can find sanctity is in the cases of miraculous images, who many people treated through text, through sort of their lived experiences as though they were people, right? And so that as if they were offers us a window into that, right? But yeah, I think they were sometimes side by side, and we would do well to talk amongst ourselves about how we can tease out those relationships. But thank you for that question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.